related to subject pronoun usage. Before getting into the topic in depth, I wanted to give a little bit of background for those of you who may not know or teach the Spanish language. And some main differences between the Spanish and the English language is that the Spanish language contains subject pronouns that you don't actually have to use within written, spoken discourse, or just conversation in general. This is because there is some implication through the morphology of the verbs with the verb endings that already directly implies who the subject of the sentence may be. An example would be with the verb bailar in Spanish, which means to dance. If I said yo bailo, that's I dance. But I don't have to say yo bailo because the only time in present tense where that o ending is going to appear with an AR verb, or any verb for that matter, for the first person, yo, is going to be if I'm describing myself doing it. Down here at the bottom of the screen to the left, you will see all of the subject pronouns. I'm not going to take time to go into all of them for the purposes of this presentation. However, I wanted to include this here if you wanted to take a look to give you some further background. Something else to note is that the Spanish language typically does follow the subject-verb-object pattern, although verb subject-object and verb object-subject are common and can be seen as well. It just depends. Here's an example of a subject, verb, object sentence, which is similar to the English language in this example because it's SVO and we see yo escucho la radio. I listen to the radio. Down below, we see mi amigo come papas fritas. In this situation, we could not leave off the mi amigo because if we just had come papas fritas, we don't know who's eating the fries. We don't know if it's he's eating them, she's eating them, somebody else. We're talking to someone saying, hey, you're eating the fries. We just don't know. Whereas down below, we've got tomamos vino por la mañana. Okay, we're drinking wine in the morning. Beautiful. We're drinking wine in the morning. We know that tomamos has to go with the nosotros subject pronoun for we are doing it because that AMOS morphology, that ending is only going to go along with the nosotros subject pronoun. So in this instance down here at the bottom, you can see where it's already implied, you don't actually have to include it, which is very different from the English language. Going along with this idea, the Spanish language is actually categorized as being a consistent null subject language because the subjects, like I had explained before, they can appear in the preverbal position, as we saw in the example before with yo escucho la radio, or they can actually appear after, which we'll see some examples of. And this is called free inversion because they're free. They can flex. They can go before. They can go after. And I teach my students that if the subject is after the verb, it's best to read it backwards because a lot of times they'll start panicking. I don't know who it's talking about. I don't understand the sentence. I can't do it. But if you read it backwards, I teach them, especially in sentences where we're talking about likes and dislikes. Me gusta el chocolate. If you read it backwards, chocolate, it's pleasing to me. I like chocolate versus I like chocolate. That's just one example. Now, all of these do go into the whole extended projection principle, which was a linguist hypothesis of subjects proposed by Noam Chomsky, and the EPP, or the extended projection principle, states that clauses must contain a noun phrase or determinative phrase in the subject position. Now, Spanish actually does lack this because of the tendency for post-verbal subject and or null subjects, which is just a fancy way of saying it's not there. Because the Spanish language is a pro-drop language, whereas the English language is not that. Typically, the English language does have that subject included in the sentence. What I was particularly interested in was in line with code switching and multilingual communities, and the impact of bilingual status or multilingual status and or code switching on the use of the null subject within the Spanish language. So what I wanted to see is if a speaker or speakers are using two or more languages in one conversation freely, does this change over time the lexical features of the Spanish language? Does this alter their tendency of using null subject pronoun? Does it play any role or impact that? Now, what the research did show, what we did see, was that it actually, code switching, it can, between Spanish and English, it can increase use of pre-verbal subjects mirroring the English language and decrease the post-verbal subjects appearing after the verb, and as a whole, lower null subject usage where there is an overt subject present subject presence, meaning it's there. We see that subject pronoun, that subject present in the sentence, whether it's needed or not. Now, some controversy or generalizations that go into play with these implications of null subject pronouns is that these are typically described as being ambiguous. And that can sound, it can come across as being kind of rude that it says ambiguous. But this is just because that context isn't provided. And if you don't know what you're looking for, it can seem confusing, which is why novice learners often do kind of freak out if it's not included in the sentence. Like, for example, me gusta el chocolate, they're like, who's it talking about? I don't understand. Because chocolate is the subject of the sentence and that is after the verb. So that's an example of a post-verbal usage. Now, what we saw in line with the research is that as the bilingual speakers became more and more proficient in the English language, we had a decreased use of the null subject and decreased use of post-verbal subjects, where we did see an increased use of pre-verbal subjects, which is in line with the fact that as they became more and more proficient in the English language, they had a tendency to use more pre-verbal subjects, which mirrors the English language and syntax. I did want to note that within the Caribbean or specifically Dominican variety of Spanish, there is another pronoun that is common or is seen, and that's called the ello pronoun. It's not el, it's not ella, it's ello. This is very specific to that region, to that variety of language of the Spanish language, and it's directly influenced by the history and trade routes of that area. That's kind of how it came to be, and this specific ello pronoun comes with some controversy because it's deemed as being inaccurate by the Royal Spanish Academy. They say that it is not standard. It's also been described as being a non-deleted null explicative and being devoid of semantic value, as if it brings no value to the table and it doesn't need to be used. It's unnecessary. It shouldn't be used. Here's an example of it being used. Ayer ello llovió mucho en el campo. And here's the English translation for you. There's a few more examples below if you would like to check these out. As it does say in the image that it can be used as a dummy pronoun with impersonal and meteorological verbs, etc., etc. There is an argument as to how the education level or age of the bilingual language learners does impact their ability to have that native-like command of the null subject. And then, as stated before, there was that overproduction seen, specifically in child bilingual learners in this study, as the students or as the children became more and more and more proficient of the English language, they had an overproduction of subject pronoun usage, meaning they were using less null subjects, less post-verbal subjects, and much more pre-verbal subjects shown in their conversations, in their interactions with others. And this goes into play with the fact that children do have two differentiated grammatical systems that do develop separately, as well as the Spanish language being a pro-drop language, whereas the English language is a non-pro-drop. So both languages have different syntax and different structure, and when they're utilized together, at times things of this nature come to happen. Something else that I found interesting in regard to age and education level is, and this does come to into play with class or privilege as well, is that study abroad experiences can be seen as being beneficial for learners acquiring the Spanish language, as it does help with acquisition and exposure to the null subject usage, as well as the fact of older language learners struggling with this acquisition of this null subject form when acquiring the Spanish language, because it is so different than the English language. And as you become older and older, it's so much more different. You have less frequency of interaction with it. You kind of are more stuck in your ways, according to what the research was saying. And just the vast difference in lexical structure from L1 or their native language of English is harder to acquire over time. And they've just had less time interacting with it. Here's an example of a class activity that I did a few years ago, and that I wanted to share with you guys in this presentation. So the students at this time, they were really interested in the Mary Poppins Returns movie with Lin-Manuel Miranda. And I utilized this as an opportunity to incorporate this Spanish article. Hablamos con Rob Marshall, Emily Vivant y Lin-Manuel. Sobre el regreso de Mary Poppins, I took a portion of the article, and the students worked in pairs or in groups of 3, small groups,